June 6th, 530 AD. 25,000 Byzantine soldiers stared across a desert plain at 40,000 Persian warriors. The largest army the Sassanid Empire had fielded in a generation. Rome's eastern frontier hung by a thread. One general, Belisarius, just 25 years old, had 7 days to save an empire. Think about those numbers. 25,000 against 40. Every tactical manual said retreat. Every veteran commander said withdraw. Yet by sunset, the Persian army would be shattered, and history's greatest offensive general would announce himself to the world. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see ancient warfare forever. First, the trench system that turned mathematics into a killing field. Second, why 600 Huns on a hill destroyed an entire Persian flank. And third, the cavalry charge that shouldn't have worked but became the most decisive moment of the 6th century. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did a 25-year-old with no major command experience outthink Persia's most experienced generals? What geometric principle did Belisarius discover that military theorists had missed for centuries? Why did the Persians walk into a trap they could clearly see? To understand how innovation defeated overwhelming numbers, we need to step back to when Rome's Eastern Empire was collapsing under Persian pressure. Spring 530 AD, and Rome was dying in the east. Not the dramatic collapse of barbarian invasions, but the slow strangulation of an empire that had forgotten how to win. For 30 years, Persian armies had raided across the frontier with impunity. They burned cities, enslaved populations, and withdrew before Roman forces could respond. The border provinces were becoming a wasteland. Imperial prestige was evaporating. And in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian faced a terrible reality. He could not defend the East and reconquer the West simultaneously. Unless something changed, the Roman Empire would lose everything east of Antioch within a decade. The numbers told a story of systematic collapse. In 500, the eastern frontier had boasted 42 fortified cities and a standing garrison of 60,000 soldiers. By 529, 18 of those cities lay in ruins. The garrison had been reduced to 35,000 men through constant attrition, disease, and budget cuts. Persian raids came annually now, sometimes twice a year. They struck deep into Roman territory, sometimes reaching within 50 miles of Antioch itself. And Rome couldn't stop them. Here's what made the situation genuinely catastrophic. Every raid wasn't just about immediate destruction. The Persians were implementing a deliberate strategy of economic strangulation. They targeted irrigation systems, burned crops before harvest, and systematically destroyed the infrastructure that made agriculture possible. Entire districts were being depopulated. Tax revenue from the eastern provinces had dropped by 40% in just 2 decades. Justinian was ruling an empire that was slowly bleeding to death through 1,000 cuts. The military situation was even worse than the economic numbers suggested. Roman commanders had developed what modern strategists would call defeat psychology. They expected to lose. When Persian armies appeared, Roman forces retreated to the nearest fortified city and waited for the raiders to leave. No one attempted to engage in open battle. No one believed victory was possible. The tactical initiative belonged entirely to Persia. They chose when to attack, where to strike, and when to withdraw. Rome simply reacted, always defensive, always passive, always losing ground. Think about what this meant for Justinian's grand strategy. The young emperor had assumed power in 527 with dreams of reconquering the Western Roman Empire. He wanted to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths, North Africa from the Vandals, and restore Rome to its former glory. But every soldier sent west was a soldier not defending the east. Every gold coin spent on western campaigns was a coin not reinforcing the Persian frontier. Justinian faced an impossible choice: pursue his western dreams and lose the east, or defend the east and abandon his vision of imperial restoration. The Persian Shah Kavad I understood this perfectly. His spies in Constantinople reported everything: Justinian's western ambitions, the depleted eastern garrisons, the emperor's financial constraints. In spring 530, Kavad made his move. He would launch the largest invasion in a generation, not a raid, but a full-scale conquest. The target was Dara, the fortress city that anchored Rome's entire eastern defensive system. If Dara fell, the frontier would collapse like a dam breaking. 20 cities would surrender without resistance. The provinces of Mesopotamia and Syria would become Persian territory. And Justinian would face a choice between humiliating peace terms or financial bankruptcy, trying to defend an indefensible position. But Kavad had made one miscalculation. He assumed Rome's commanders were all the same: cautious, defensive, defeated in spirit before the first arrow flew. He didn't know that Justinian had just appointed a new general to the Eastern Command, a 25-year-old who had never commanded a major army. A young officer who believed battles were won through mathematics, not courage. The Persians were about to meet Belisarius, and nothing would ever be the same. Belisarius was 25 years old when Justinian gave him the Eastern Command. Most generals waited until their 40s to lead armies. Most had decades of campaign experience. Belisarius had served as a junior officer in border skirmishes and one minor campaign. His appointment shocked the army establishment. Veterans whispered that Justinian had lost his mind, that nepotism had overcome sense, that youth and ambition were being confused with competence. They were about to discover that some minds are built for war regardless of age. Belisarius had spent his entire life studying the mathematics of battle. He saw warfare as geometry, as angles and distances and killing zones. He was about to prove that innovation matters more than experience. The reaction in the Eastern Army was immediate and brutal. When the appointment was announced in April 530, 3 senior commanders requested immediate transfer back to Constantinople. They refused to serve under what one officer called a boy playing at war. 12 veteran tribunes submitted formal protests directly to the emperor. The complaint was always the same: Belisarius lacked the experience to command 25,000 men against the full might of Persia. They were right about the experience. They were catastrophically wrong about everything else. Here's what those veteran commanders didn't understand. Belisarius had spent 7 years doing something no other Roman officer had bothered to attempt. He had systematically studied every recorded battle between Rome and Persia for the past 2 centuries. He had analyzed terrain, casualty ratios, tactical formations, and the specific moments when battles turned. He had interviewed survivors from defeated Roman armies, asking not about courage or glory, but about distances, angles of attack, and the precise sequence of tactical movements. He had filled notebooks with diagrams that looked more like geometric proofs than military plans. The numbers from his research told a story that obsessed him. In 63 recorded battles between Rome and Persia over the past 200 years, the Persians had won 41. Roman victories came almost exclusively when defending fortified positions or when Persian cavalry was somehow neutralized. Persian defeats happened when their numerical superiority couldn't be brought to bear, when terrain channeled their forces into narrow fronts, when their cavalry advantage was mathematically negated. Think about what this meant. Belisarius wasn't interested in courage or morale or the fighting spirit of his troops. He was interested in creating battlefield conditions where Persian advantages literally could not function. He was thinking about warfare the way a mathematician thinks about proofs. If you control the variables, you control the outcome. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. Belisarius arrived at his headquarters in DARA on May 15th, 530. His chief of staff handed him the intelligence reports. A Persian invasion force was assembling. Current estimates suggested 35 to 40,000 warriors. They would march within 3 weeks. Belisarius had 25,000 soldiers, many of them demoralized from years of defeats. Every tactical manual, every military doctrine, every veteran officer said the same thing. Withdraw to the strongest fortifications and then wait for reinforcements that weren't coming. Belisarius looked at the numbers and smiled. He called his senior officers together and announced a decision that made half of them think he was suicidal. They would not retreat. They would not hide behind Dara's walls. They would meet the Persians in open battle. And they would win using something Persia had never encountered. A defensive system that turned geometry into a weapon more deadly than any sword. The officers stared at him in stunned silence. One finally spoke. Quote 2, Belisarius cut him off. Quote 3. The veterans exchanged glances. The boy general had just committed the entire Eastern Army to a battle that couldn't be won. What they didn't know was that Belisarius had already calculated every angle, every distance, every variable. In his mind, the Battle of Dara was already over. The Persians had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. Shah Kavad I received the reports from his western frontier with satisfaction. Rome's new emperor was young, ambitious, and distracted. Justinian was planning western campaigns, dreaming of reconquering Italy and Africa. The eastern frontier was defended by scattered garrisons and an untested boy general. This was Persia's moment. Kavad summoned his greatest general, a commander named Perozes, and gave him 40,000 of the empire's finest warriors. The mission was simple: invade Roman Mesopotamia, capture the fortress city of Dara, and demonstrate that Rome could no longer defend its eastern provinces. If Dara fell, the entire frontier would collapse. 20 cities would open their gates. The Romans would sue for peace from a position of catastrophic weakness. The invasion force that assembled at Nisibis in May 530 was the largest Persian army fielded in over a generation. 40,000 warriors represented nearly a quarter of the Sassanid Empire's total military strength. This wasn't a raid. This was a statement. Kavad was wagering the prestige of his entire dynasty on a single campaign. If it succeeded, Rome would be permanently crippled in the east. If it failed, but failure wasn't a possibility Persian planners even considered. Here's what made the Persian confidence so absolute. Perozes wasn't some untested commander given an army because of political connections. He had fought the Romans for 23 years. He had led cavalry charges at the Battle of Amida. He had commanded the successful siege of Theodosiopolis. He knew Roman tactics better than most Roman generals, and he had never lost a major engagement against Roman forces. The Shah was sending his most experienced general with overwhelming force against a 25-year-old boy who had never commanded anything larger than a border garrison. The composition of Perozes' army was designed specifically to exploit Roman weaknesses. 12,000 of his warriors were cavalry, heavily armored cataphracts on massive horses bred specifically for shock combat. These weren't nimble skirmishers. These were living battering rams that could shatter infantry formations through sheer kinetic force. Another 8,000 were elite infantry, professional soldiers who had trained together for years. The remaining 20,000 consisted of auxiliary troops, archers, and support units. Think about those numbers. Persians had more cavalry than Belisarius had soldiers total. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Persian military doctrine. The Sassanid Empire had spent 3 centuries perfecting a specific tactical system designed to defeat Roman armies. It worked the same way every time. First, cavalry would probe the Roman flanks, searching for weaknesses. Second, archers would suppress Roman defensive fire while infantry advanced. Third, once the Romans were fixed in position and exhausted, cavalry would execute the killing blow, a flanking maneuver that rolled up the enemy line from the side. This system had destroyed Roman armies from Antioch to Armenia. It had never failed when the Persians had numerical superiority. Persians studied the intelligence reports as his army prepared to march. The Romans were concentrating at DARA. Good. That meant they wouldn't scatter and force him to chase down multiple garrisons. They were going to defend in the open field rather than hiding behind walls. Even better. The boy general had apparently ordered his soldiers to dig trenches. Persians actually laughed when he heard this. Trenches were obstacles that slowed attacks. They didn't stop 40,000 warriors. If anything, trenches would trap the Romans in fixed positions, making them easier targets for his cavalry once they swept around the flanks. On May 27th, 530, Persians gave the order to march. 40,000 warriors began moving west toward DARA. They covered 15 miles per day, a steady, confident advance. No forced marches, no urgency. Why rush? The Romans weren't going anywhere. They were waiting to die. Persian scouts rode ahead, reporting back every detail of the Roman positions. The numbers confirmed everything Persians expected. 25,000 Romans. Some kind of elaborate trench system that made no tactical sense. A few cavalry units on the flanks. And bizarrely, a small force of what appeared to be Hun mercenaries positioned on an isolated hill. The deployment looked confused, almost desperate. Like a commander who didn't understand how to use terrain or position his forces effectively. Persians had seen this before. Young, inexperienced officers making their first major command decisions often created elaborate defensive systems because they were terrified of making mistakes. They overthought everything, built complicated plans that fell apart the moment a real combat started. This boy general had clearly read too many military treatises and not spent enough time on actual battlefields. The Persian army would arrive at DARA on June 6th. Persians estimated the battle would be over by noon, perhaps earlier if the Romans broke quickly. He had already composed the victory dispatch he would send to Shah Kavad. What Persians didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every assumption he had just made was exactly what Belisarius wanted him to think. The trenches that looked confused were actually a geometric trap. The deployment that seemed desperate was mathematically precise. And that isolated Hun force on the hill wasn't a mistake. It was bait. The Persians were marching confidently toward the most sophisticated battlefield system ever designed. And they had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. Belisarius received word of the Persian invasion in late May. 40,000 warriors were marching toward DARA. They would arrive in approximately 10 days. He had 25,000 soldiers scattered across multiple garrisons. The mathematics were brutal. Even if he concentrated his entire force at DARA, he would be outnumbered nearly 2-to-1. Standard Roman doctrine said to withdraw behind the strongest fortifications and wait for reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements. Justinian's army was committed elsewhere. If Belisarius retreated, DARA would fall, and the frontier with it. So the young general made a decision that defied every military manual in existence. He would defend DARA in the open field. He would meet 40,000 Persians with 25,000 Romans. And he would win through something the Persians had never seen before. May 28th, 530. Dawn. Belisarius stood on the plain north of DARA and began sketching in the dirt with a stick. His senior officers gathered around, watching their commander draw lines and angles that looked nothing like traditional battlefield deployments. What he was designing wasn't a defensive position. It was a killing machine disguised as a trench system. The plain north of DARA was approximately 2 miles wide, bounded by low hills on both sides. Flat, open ground, exactly the terrain where Persian cavalry excelled. Every Roman general who had ever fought Persians knew to avoid this kind of battlefield. Belisarius had deliberately chosen it. His officers exchanged nervous glances. The boy general wasn't just ignoring doctrine. He was doing the exact opposite of everything they had been taught. Here's what made Belisarius's plan genuinely revolutionary. Traditional defensive trenches ran parallel to the enemy's line of advance. Straight barriers meant to slow attacks. Belisarius designed something completely different. His trenches would run at angles, creating a geometric pattern that channeled attacking forces into predetermined zones. Picture a funnel made of ditches. The Persians would be forced to attack through specific corridors where their numbers became irrelevant, where only a fraction of their force could engage at any moment. The dimensions were precise. Main trench, 5 feet deep, 6 feet wide, running 200 yards across the center of the battlefield. Secondary trenches, 4 feet deep, angled at 30 degrees from the main line, creating triangular killing zones. Tertiary positions, shallow excavations for archers, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Every measurement mattered. Every angle was calculated to maximize defensive advantage and minimize Persian mobility. Think about what this required. Belisarius had 7 days to move 25,000 soldiers, concentrate them at DARA, and dig a trench system complex enough to negate a 40,000-man army. The numbers defied belief. His engineers calculated they needed to excavate approximately 30,000 cubic yards of earth. With the labor force available, that meant every soldier would need to move roughly 1.5 cubic yards of dirt in 7 days, while maintaining security patrols, organizing supplies, and preparing for battle. May 29th. The digging began. Belisarius divided his army into shifts. 8,000 soldiers worked while 17,000 rested or maintained defensive positions. Every 4 hours, the shifts rotated. Officers monitored the excavations with measuring ropes, ensuring every trench matched the geometric specifications exactly. 6 inches too wide or 3 inches too shallow could compromise the entire system. By June 1st, the main trench was complete. By June 3rd, the secondary angles were finished. By June 5th, the entire geometric pattern was carved into the plain. A mathematical proof written in dirt and stone. Roman soldiers looked at what they had built and still didn't understand what they were seeing. It looked like elaborate field fortifications. It was actually the most sophisticated tactical system ever deployed in ancient warfare. But here's where Belisarius's plan became genuinely insane. The trenches alone wouldn't win the battle. They would channel the Persians, limit their mobility, break up their formations. But 40,000 warriors could eventually overwhelm even the best designed defensive position through sheer attrition. Belisarius needed something more. He needed a decisive strike capability that could shatter Persian morale at the perfect moment. He needed cavalry. Specifically, he needed horse archers who could operate independently, strike with devastating precision, and wouldn't break under pressure. He needed warriors who fought for glory rather than pay, who would recognize the perfect tactical moment instinctively. He needed Huns. On June 4th, 600 Hun mercenaries rode into Dara's camp under two brothers named Sunicus and Aigen. They were expensive. Belisarius paid them 3 times the standard mercenary rate. They were unreliable. Hun cavalry had a reputation for fleeing if battles turned against them. They were absolutely essential. Without them, the geometric trap was just a defensive position. With them, it became a weapon that could destroy an empire's army. Belisarius met with Sunicus and Aigen privately. He showed them the battlefield layout. He explained their position, an isolated hill on the left flank. He told them exactly what would happen. Persian cavalry would see them as vulnerable, would commit major forces to eliminate them, would charge uphill into Hun arrows. Sunicus studied the terrain and smiled. "You're using us as bait. I'm giving you the opportunity to destroy 8,000 Persian cavalry with 600 warriors," Belisarius replied. "If that's bait, it's the most dangerous bait in military history." The Hun brothers looked at each other. This Roman general understood something most commanders missed. Huns didn't fight for causes or empires. They fought for glory and the chance to achieve the impossible. Sunicus nodded. June 5th evening. The trench system was complete. The army was positioned. The Huns were ready. Tomorrow, 40,000 Persians would arrive and see what appeared to be a confused defensive deployment by an inexperienced commander. They would see exactly what Belisarius wanted them to see. And then the mathematics of warfare would teach Persia a lesson it would never forget. For 7 days, Belisarius's soldiers dug. Not walls, not ramparts, not the traditional fortifications any Roman general would have ordered. Trenches. Specifically, a geometric pattern of trenches that created overlapping fields of fire and channeled enemy movement into predetermined killing zones. The veterans thought he was insane. Trenches were defensive obstacles meant to slow attacks, not win battles. But Belisarius wasn't thinking about defense. He was thinking about mathematics. If you could force 40,000 men to attack through specific corridors, if you could eliminate their numerical advantage by controlling where they could move, if you could create situations where only a fraction of their army could engage at any moment, then numbers stopped mattering. The trench system at Dara was the physical embodiment of a geometric proof. Here's what made the system revolutionary. Traditional Roman defensive doctrine focused on creating barriers, walls, palisades, ditches that ran parallel to the enemy. These obstacles slowed attacks, but didn't fundamentally change battlefield dynamics. An army of 40,000 could still bring its full weight against a defender of 25,000. The numbers still mattered. Belisarius designed something that broke this equation entirely. The main trench ran perpendicular to the Persian line of advance, but the secondary trenches angled outward at precisely 30 degrees, creating wedge-shaped corridors. Picture 3 funnels, each 200 yards wide at the opening, but narrowing to barely 80 yards at the Roman line. Any Persian force attacking through these corridors would be compressed, unable to deploy their full width, forced to bunch together. And bunched soldiers made perfect targets for archers positioned on the elevated ground behind the trenches. The mathematics were brutal and elegant. If the Persians attacked with their full force of 40,000, Only about 6,000 could actually engage at the narrow points simultaneously. The rest would be waiting in the corridors, exposed to arrow fire, unable to help their comrades at the front. Belisarius had turned a 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage into a position where he could achieve local superiority at every point of contact. But here's where it gets genuinely brilliant. The trench system wasn't static. Belisarius positioned mobile reserves, cavalry units of 500 to 800 men, behind each corridor. If the Persians broke through at any point, these reserves could immediately plug the gap. If the Persians focused on one corridor, the reserves from the other sections could strike their flanks. The entire defensive system was dynamic, responsive, capable of adapting to any Persian tactical decision. Think about what this required from the soldiers executing it. Every archer needed to know their exact firing position, their assigned corridor, their backup position if forced to retreat. Every cavalry reserve needed to understand the timing of their counterattacks. Too early, and they'd waste their momentum. Too late, and the line would collapse. Every infantry unit holding the trenches needed the discipline to stand firm, while Persian cavalry charged directly at them. One unit breaking could compromise the entire geometric system. On June 5th, as the sun set over the completed trench network, Belisarius walked the entire defensive line. He stopped at each position, explaining to the soldiers exactly what would happen the next day. "The Persians will see these trenches and think we're afraid," he told them. "They'll see defensive positions and assume we're weak. They'll charge thinking they face a static enemy. What they'll actually face is a battlefield where every variable is controlled, every angle calculated, every movement predicted." A veteran centurion, skeptical throughout the entire construction process, finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "General, what if they simply refuse to attack through the corridors? What if they mass their entire force against one section and overwhelm us through sheer numbers?" Belisarius smiled. "Then they'll spend hours forming up in front of our trenches while our archers shoot them at leisure. And when they finally commit everything to one corridor, our cavalry reserves will have all day to position for a flanking strike. Either way, their numbers work against them." The centurion stared at the geometric pattern carved into the plain and suddenly understood. This wasn't a defensive position designed to survive. This was a trap designed to destroy. Every decision the Persians made would be wrong because Belisarius had already calculated all the possibilities. The battlefield had become a mathematical problem where only one solution existed: Roman victory. But mathematics only works if the soldiers executing the plan hold their positions. If panic breaks the line, if discipline fails, if any unit runs before the plan unfolds, the entire system collapses. Belisarius had built the perfect tactical machine. Now he needed 25,000 men to become perfect components of that machine. June 6th would prove whether human courage could match geometric precision. The Persians were 12 hours away, and somewhere in the darkness, 40,000 warriors marched confidently toward a battlefield that had been designed specifically to kill them. Belisarius had one advantage the Persians didn't know about. 600 Hun mercenaries, the finest horse archers in the world, led by two brothers named Sunicus and Igon. These were not Roman soldiers. They owed no loyalty to Constantinople, only to their contract and the general who paid them. Huns had destroyed the Western Roman Empire a century earlier. Now Belisarius would use their descendants to save the Eastern Empire. But Hun cavalry was unpredictable, prone to fleeing if battle turned against them, impossible to control once fighting started. Every Roman commander who had employed Huns had stories of their unreliability. Belisarius had a different plan. He would give them complete autonomy, position them where they could win the battle with a single charge, and trust that their warrior culture would recognize the perfect moment when it arrived. The cost was staggering. Belisarius paid Sunicus and Aigen 90 gold solidi per man, triple the standard mercenary rate. For 600 warriors, that meant 54,000 solidi, roughly equivalent to the annual military budget for an entire border province. His logistics officer had protested. "General, for that price, we could hire 1,800 regular cavalry." Belisarius had replied with a question that ended the discussion. "Can your regular cavalry destroy 8,000 Persian cataphracts while outnumbered 13 to 1? The officer had gone silent. They both knew the answer. Here's what made Hun horse archers so devastatingly effective. A Roman archer, standing on solid ground with a longbow, could fire approximately 10 aimed shots per minute. A Persian horse archer, firing from horseback while moving, could manage 6 to 8 shots per minute. A Hun warrior could fire 12. Think about that. 600 Huns could put 7,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds, from horseback while moving, with accuracy that Persian commanders had described in their chronicles as, quote, 14. But the real weapon wasn't the rate of fire. It was the composite bow. Hun bows were constructed from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, creating a weapon that could punch through armor at distances where Persian arrows bounced off shields. A Hun arrow fired at 100 yards could penetrate scale armor and kill the man wearing it. At 50 yards, it could go through a horse's skull. The Persians had heavy cavalry. The Huns had weapons specifically designed to kill heavy cavalry. June 5th evening, Belisarius met with Sunicus and Aigen on the hill that would become their position. From this elevation, they could see the entire battlefield, the trench system, the Roman lines, the approaches the Persians would use. Sunicus studied the terrain with the eye of a predator evaluating hunting ground. Quote, 15, quote, 16, Belisarius corrected. Quote, 17, Aigen laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Quote, 18, quote, 19, Belisarius said. Quote, 20, Sunicus and Aigen exchanged glances. Something passed between the brothers, an understanding that didn't require words. Sunicus turned back to Belisarius. "Roman, you don't understand Hun warriors. We don't flee because we're losing. We flee when there's no glory in staying. You're offering us the chance to destroy an army that outnumbers us 15 to 1. You're giving us a story our grandchildren will tell. We'll hold this hill until every arrow is gone or every Persian is dead." But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that conversation. Belisarius had one more card to play, one more variable that would turn the Hun position from defensive strongpoint into the decisive weapon of the entire battle. He pointed to the base of the hill, where the terrain flattened into open ground. When the Persian cavalry breaks, and they will break, they'll retreat through that corridor. Your pursuit will drive them directly into my cavalry reserves waiting on the flank. The survivors will carry stories of 600 demons who couldn't be killed. The Persian right flank will cease to exist, and you'll have achieved something no Hun force has accomplished in a century. You'll have saved Rome. Aigen grinned, and showing teeth filed to points in the old steppe tradition. We'll make Attila proud. June 6th, dawn broke cold and clear over DARA. On the isolated hill, 600 Hun warriors checked their bowstrings, counted their arrows, and waited. Each man carried approximately 60 shafts, 36,000 arrows total. Think about those numbers. If they maintained their rate of fire, they could sustain 7,000 arrows per minute for just over 5 minutes of continuous shooting. After that, they'd be down to sidearms and close combat weapons. 5 minutes to destroy 8,000 Persian cavalry. The mathematics seemed impossible. But mathematics had a way of changing when Huns were involved. The brothers Sunicus and Igon had given Belisarius their word. And on the steppe, a Hun's word was written in the blood of his enemies. The Persians were about to discover what happened when you charged 600 demons positioned on high ground. What happened next would become legend. The kind of story that made warriors from Constantinople to the Caspian Sea whisper one simple truth: never, ever attack Huns uphill. June 6th, dawn. The Persian army appeared on the horizon like a slow-moving thunderstorm. 40,000 warriors in perfect formation, cavalry on the flanks, infantry in the center, siege equipment rolling behind them. General Perazes had marched from Persia with one mission: crush the boy general and take Dara. He had numerical superiority, better cavalry, more experienced commanders. By every conventional measure, this should be a simple victory. His scouts had reported the Roman positions, including the bizarre trench system. Perazes studied the battlefield and smiled. The Romans had dug their own graves. Those trenches would trap them when the Persian cavalry swept around the flanks. This boy general had made his first and last tactical mistake. The Persian deployment took 3 hours. 40,000 warriors don't simply rush into battle. They form up with mathematical precision, each unit in its assigned position, each commander knowing exactly what his forces would do. By 8 a.m., the formation was complete. 12,000 cavalry divided between both flanks, 6,000 on each side. 20,000 infantry in the center, arranged in blocks of 4,000 men each. 8,000 support troops, archers, engineers, and reserves, positioned behind the main force. The numbers were overwhelming. Perazes rode slowly along his front lines, inspecting the formations. Everything was perfect. His cavalry commanders were veterans of a dozen campaigns. His infantry had trained together for years. His archers could darken the sky with arrows. And across the plain, separated by barely 800 yards, stood 25,000 Romans who looked exactly like every defeated Roman army he had ever faced. Disciplined, well-equipped, professionally arranged, and doomed. Here's what Perazes saw when he studied the Roman positions. The trench system created 3 obvious attack corridors, each about 200 yards wide at the opening. The Roman infantry stood behind these trenches in dense formations. Cavalry units were visible on both flanks, maybe 4,000 riders total. And bizarrely, on an isolated hill on the Roman left, a small force of what appeared to be steppe mercenaries, probably Huns based on their equipment, sat completely separated from the main Roman line. That isolated Hun position fascinated Perazes. It violated every principle of sound tactics. You never left a unit completely unsupported, especially not on elevated terrain that could serve as an observation post or rally point. The boy general had apparently positioned his mercenaries where they could observe the battle, but couldn't actually participate effectively. It was the kind of mistake young commanders made when they read military treatises, but lacked battlefield experience. Perazes made a mental note. Once the main assault was underway, commit cavalry to sweep away those Huns. Can't leave an enemy force, even a small one, sitting on your flank. But the trenches themselves were what convinced Perazes this would be an easy victory. Traditional Persian doctrine emphasized mobility. Cavalry sweeping around static defensive positions, encircling enemies, forcing them to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. These trenches appeared designed to stop exactly that strategy. But here's what the boy general had missed. Trenches only work if the enemy lacks the numbers to overwhelm them. Peroz had 40,000 warriors. He could afford to feed 20,000 into those corridors and still have cavalry sweeping the flanks. The Romans would be crushed between frontal assault and flanking maneuvers. Textbook tactics defeating textbook defenses. At 9 a.m., Peroz called his commanders together for final instructions. Quote 24. A cavalry commander raised a concern. Quote 25. Peroz cut him off. Quote 26. Think about what this meant. Peroz had completely misunderstood the battlefield. He saw static defenses where Belisarius had created dynamic kill zones. He saw trapped Romans where Belisarius had positioned mobile reserves. He saw isolated Huns where Belisarius had placed the decisive weapon of the entire battle. Every assumption Peroz made was logical, based on decades of experience, supported by conventional military wisdom. And every assumption was exactly what Belisarius needed him to believe. Across the plain, Belisarius watched the Persian formations through the early morning haze. He could see the cavalry massing on both flanks. He could see the infantry preparing for the central assault. He could see commanders gesturing, organizing, implementing exactly the tactical plan he had predicted they would use. Everything was proceeding according to mathematics. He turned to his second-in-command, a veteran officer named Hermogenes. Quote 27. Hermogenes studied the Persian positions. Quote 28. Quote 29. Belisarius confirmed. Quote 39:30 a.m. The Persian horns sounded. The first probe began to move. 2,000 cavalry started trotting toward the Roman right flank. Not a full charge yet. Just a probing attack meant to test the Roman response and identify weaknesses. Belisarius raised his hand. Along the Roman lines, soldiers shifted into their assigned positions. Archers notched arrows. Cavalry reserves moved to pre-planned positions behind the trenches. On the distant hill, 600 Huns checked their bowstrings one final time. The Battle of DARA was about to begin, and 40,000 Persians were marching confidently into a geometric trap that would redefine ancient warfare. They had no idea that the battlefield itself had become a weapon. They had no idea that every decision they made from this moment forward would be wrong. They had no idea that the boy general had already won. The Persians just hadn't died yet. Belisarius positioned his army with geometric precision. The center held 20,000 infantry, standing directly behind the main trench line. These were not Rome's elite legions from centuries past, but they were disciplined, well-armored, and trained to hold formation. On each flank, cavalry units positioned themselves behind secondary trenches, ready to strike at Persian flanks if they committed too deeply. And on a low hill on the left flank, 600 Hun archers waited under Sunicas and Aegon, seemingly isolated from the main Roman force. To Persian observers, it looked like a confused deployment. To Belisarius, it was a trap with mathematical certainty. The Persians would see the isolated Huns as a weakness. They would commit cavalry to eliminate this exposed unit. And when they did, the killing field would activate. Here's what made the deployment genuinely brilliant. Every unit's position was calculated based on specific distances and angles. The main infantry line stood exactly 60 yards behind the primary trench, close enough to defend it, far enough to avoid being trapped against it if Persians broke through. The cavalry reserves positioned themselves 120 yards behind the flanks. Precisely the distance needed to build momentum for a devastating charge. but close enough to respond within 90 seconds if needed. The archer positions were even more precisely calculated. Belisarius had positioned 3,000 bowmen in staggered formations behind the trenches. Each archer had a designated firing lane, a specific corridor where his arrows would fall. The overlapping fields of fire created zones where a charging enemy would be hit by arrows from 3 different angles simultaneously. Roman military engineers had measured every distance with ropes, marked every position with stakes. This wasn't a battlefield deployment. It was a geometric proof carved into dirt and blood. Think about what this level of precision required. Every archer needed to know exactly where to stand, exactly where to aim, exactly when to fire. Every infantry unit needed to understand their position in the larger pattern. Too far forward and they'd be isolated. Too far back and they'd create gaps the Persians could exploit. Every cavalry commander needed to know the precise moment to charge, the exact angle of attack, the specific speed needed to maximize impact. One unit out of position could compromise the entire mathematical structure. But here's where it gets insane. Belisarius wasn't just positioning troops. He was creating a dynamic system that would respond automatically to Persian decisions. If the Persians attacked the right corridor, the left and center reserves would shift to support. If they focused on the left, the entire system would pivot. The battlefield wasn't static. It was a living mechanism where every component had multiple predetermined responses based on enemy actions. At 8:45 a.m., Belisarius walked the lines one final time. He stopped at each commander's position, confirming they understood not just their orders, but the mathematical principles underlying those orders. To the center infantry commander. They'll hit you first. 10,000 Persians through the main corridor. You'll hold for exactly 1 hour. Not 59 minutes, not 61. 60 minutes. That's how long it takes to exhaust their first wave without breaking your own formations. To the right, cavalry commander. When their infantry engages the center, their cavalry will probe your flank. Let them come to within 80 yards of the secondary trench. Then withdraw 50 yards. Make them think you're retreating. When they commit to pursuit, wheel and strike their exposed flank. The trench will prevent their reinforcements from supporting them quickly enough. To the left, cavalry commander. Your mission is the most critical. When the Persians send cavalry against the Huns, you'll see 8,000 riders climbing that hill. Wait until they're fully committed, until they can't retreat without exposing their backs. Then charge their flank from this position. The angle of your attack combined with Hun arrows from above will create a crossfire that makes retreat impossible. Each commander confirmed they understood. But understanding orders and executing them under the pressure of 40,000 screaming Persians were different things. Belisarius knew this. Every military plan collapsed when actual combat started. But he had built redundancy into the system. If one unit failed, others could compensate. If one commander panicked, the geometric structure would hold because it didn't depend on individual heroism. It depended on mathematical relationships between positions. Hermogenes approached as Belisarius finished his inspections. Quote 34. Belisarius pointed at the trench system, at the carefully positioned reserves. At the Hun force on the hill. Quote 35. Hermogenes studied the positions. Quote 36. Quote 37. Belisarius corrected. Quote 38. 9 a.m. The Persian horns sounded. Across 800 yards of open ground, 2,000 Persian cavalry began moving toward the Roman right flank. The first probe, the first test, the first piece of the geometric proof that would be written in Persian blood. Belisarius climbed to an observation post behind his center lines. From here, he could see the entire battlefield, could track every unit's position, could signal reserves when needed. He had done everything possible. The mathematics were perfect. The positions were optimal. The plan was flawless. Now he needed 25,000 men to execute that plan, while 40,000 Persians tried to kill them. Now he needed human courage to match geometric precision. Now the theorem would be tested against reality. The Persian cavalry charge picked up speed. Roman soldiers gripped their weapons tighter. Archers drew their bows, and somewhere on a distant hill, 600 Huns watched and waited for the moment when mathematics would transform into slaughter. The Battle of DARA had begun. At 9 a.m., Persian sent forward his first probing attack. 2,000 cavalry, armored lancers on horses bred for shock combat, charged toward the Roman right flank. This was standard Persian doctrine. Test the enemy's response, identify weaknesses, withdraw before taking serious casualties. The lancers thundered across the plain, picking up speed, preparing to wheel away at the last moment and shower the Romans with arrows. Then they hit the trench system. Horses stumbled as they attempted to cross the excavations. Riders found their charge disrupted, their formation broken. Roman archers, positioned behind the trenches with perfect fields of fire, began methodically shooting into the confused mass. Within minutes, 200 Persians lay dead or wounded. The probe withdrew in disorder. Persian frowned. Those trenches were more effective than he had anticipated. The mathematics of the engagement revealed exactly what Belisarius had designed. 2,000 cavalry charging at full speed covered the 800 yards to the Roman lines in approximately 90 seconds. But the final 100 yards, the approach to the trench system, slowed them dramatically. Horses couldn't maintain gallop speed while navigating broken ground. The charge that should have hit with maximum kinetic force arrived fragmented and confused. Here's what the Persian cavalry experienced. The first riders reached the main trench at full speed, 5 feet deep, 6 feet wide. Too wide to jump, too deep to ignore. Horses attempted to leap and fell short, crashing into the far wall. Riders behind them couldn't stop in time and piled into the obstacle. The neat formation of 2,000 lancers became a chaotic mass of confused horses and shouting men bunched together in a kill zone barely 60 yards wide. Roman archers had been waiting for exactly this moment. 300 bowmen assigned to the right flank corridor began firing in coordinated volleys. Not scattered shots, but massed fire directed at specific sections of the trapped cavalry. At 60 yards, Roman arrows punched through Persian scale armor. At 40 yards, they went through shields. The Persians tried to wheel away to execute their standard withdrawal maneuver, but the trench system prevented quick disengagement. Retreating required navigating the same obstacles that had disrupted their advance. Think about those casualty numbers. 200 dead or wounded from a force of 2,000 in less than 5 minutes. That's a 10% casualty rate from a probing attack that was supposed to be low risk. Worse, most of those casualties came from officers and front-rank soldiers. The veterans who led charges, the experienced warriors who maintained formation under pressure. The probe had cost Persian not just numbers, but quality. The Roman right flank commander, watching the Persian withdrawal, felt a surge of confidence. The trenches worked exactly as Belisarius had promised. But Belisarius himself, observing from his command position, showed no emotion. One probe meant nothing. Persian had 40,000 warriors. He could afford to lose 200 testing Roman defenses. The real question was what the Persian commander would do with the information he'd just gained. At 9:20 a.m., Persian received the casualty reports from his probe. 217 dead, 83 wounded seriously enough to remove them from combat. 300 total casualties from what should have been a simple reconnaissance. His cavalry commander offered an explanation. "General, those trenches are positioned to channel charges into narrow fronts. Our numbers couldn't deploy effectively. Perhaps we should do exactly what those trenches are trying to prevent." Eov Perazes interrupted. "The boy general has built obstacles because he fears our cavalry. So we don't use cavalry against his center. We use infantry. 20,000 soldiers can fill those trenches with corpses if necessary. Once the center is engaged, cavalry sweeps the flanks where the trench system is weakest." It was textbook doctrine. Use your strength against enemy weakness. The Romans had built defenses against cavalry, so commit infantry instead. Then exploit mobility advantages elsewhere. Every Persian officer nodded agreement. The plan made perfect tactical sense. What none of them understood was that Belisarius had anticipated this exact response. The trench system wasn't designed to stop cavalry permanently. It was designed to channel Persian decision-making. By making cavalry charges obviously costly, the trenches would force Perazes to commit infantry to the center. And infantry trapped in narrow corridors, engaged in grinding combat with Roman defensive lines, couldn't respond quickly when the real killing blow fell on the flanks. The probe had succeeded brilliantly for both sides. Perazes had learned that frontal cavalry charges wouldn't work. Belisarius had confirmed that the Persian commander would respond exactly as predicted. The geometric trap was functioning perfectly. But here's what made the next phase genuinely terrifying. Perazes was about to commit 20,000 infantry, half his entire army, to grinding combat in the central corridor. For the next 2 hours, those soldiers would be locked in brutal melee, unable to maneuver, unable to withdraw quickly, completely fixed in position. And while they bled against Roman shields, Belisarius would be positioning his cavalry reserves for strikes against the Persian flanks. At 10 a.m., Persian horns sounded again. This time, the sound was different. Not the quick notes of a probing attack, but the long, sustained blast that meant general assault. 20,000 Persian infantry began moving forward in massive blocks. 4,000 men wide, 5 ranks deep, advancing at the steady pace of soldiers who knew they were walking into a killing field, but believed their numbers would carry them through. Roman soldiers watched them come, 20,000 warriors advancing like a human tide. The mathematics suddenly felt less certain, the geometric precision less comforting. Because watching that many soldiers march toward you with weapons drawn made every calculation seem abstract compared to the very concrete reality of imminent combat. Belisarius raised his hand. Along the Roman lines, officers repeated the signal. Archers drew their bows. Infantry gripped their shields tighter. And in trenches carved into desert soil, 25,000 Romans prepared to prove that mathematics could defeat mass. The real battle was about to begin. And both armies were about to discover that the difference between tactical theory and tactical reality is measured in blood. At 11 a.m., Perazes changed tactics. If trenches disrupted cavalry, infantry would fill them. He sent forward 10,000-foot soldiers, a human wave meant to overwhelm the Roman center through sheer mass. The Persian infantry advanced in tight formation, shields raised, prepared to absorb arrow fire and close to melee combat. Roman archers fired in coordinated volleys, 3,000 arrows per minute, creating a steel rain that thinned the Persian ranks. But 10,000 men could absorb terrible casualties and still reach the trenches. The first Persian units jumped into the excavations, scrambled up the opposite side, and crashed into the Roman line. The sound was like a building collapse. Men screamed. Swords rang against shields. Blood turned the dust to mud. The approach took 12 minutes. 800 yards at the measured pace of heavy infantry carrying shields and wearing armor. Roman archers fired continuously during the entire advance. 3,000 bowmen, each loosing approximately one arrow every 6 seconds. Think about those numbers. 30,000 arrows fired during the Persian approach. Not all found targets. Some fell short, some overshot. Some struck shields without penetrating. But even with a conservative hit rate of 20%, that meant 6,000 arrows found flesh before the Persians reached the trenches. Here's what that casualty rate actually meant. 10,000 Persian infantry began the advance. 600 were dead or wounded before they crossed half the distance. Another 400 fell in the final 200 yards, where arrow accuracy improved dramatically. 1,000 casualties, 10% of the attacking force, eliminated before a single sword struck a shield. Any army in history would have broken under that kind of punishment. The Persians kept coming. The first wave hit the main trench at 11:12 a.m. What happened next revealed the true genius and the brutal limitation of Belisarius's geometric system. The trenches channeled the 10,000 attackers into 3 corridors, each barely 80 yards wide at the Roman line. That meant approximately 3,000 Persians per corridor. But only the front rank, roughly 200 men, could actually engage in combat at any moment. The remaining 2,800 soldiers in each corridor were packed behind the fighting, waiting their turn, exposed to continued arrow fire but unable to help their comrades at the front. Persian soldiers jumped into the 5-foot-deep trenches and scrambled up the opposite side. They emerged directly in front of Roman shield walls positioned on slightly elevated ground. The Romans had every advantage: high ground, stable footing, shields already locked. The Persians were climbing, off balance, shields lowered for the climb. Roman spears thrust downward into exposed faces and necks. Swords struck at Persians still pulling themselves up from the trenches. But 10,000 men create their own momentum. For every Persian who fell, another climbed up behind him. The bodies of the dead became stepping stones that made the trench easier to cross. Within 20 minutes, Persian forces had established footholds on the Roman side of all 3 trenches. The organized Roman shield wall began fragmenting into dozens of individual melees. The mathematical precision that had dominated the morning dissolved into the chaos of close combat. 11:35 a.m. The Roman center was holding, but barely. Casualty reports reached Belisarius's command post. 800 Romans down, half dead, half too wounded to continue fighting. Persian casualties were approximately 3,000. Their frontal assault across the trenches had been catastrophically expensive. But the Persians had numbers to spend. They were rotating fresh troops to the front, pulling exhausted soldiers back, maintaining pressure that never relented. Here's where the geometric system showed its limitation. The trenches could channel attacks, could create favorable combat ratios, could maximize defensive advantage. But they couldn't make Roman soldiers invincible. Men got tired, shields broke, formations wavered, and 10,000 Persians could grind through 8,000 Romans through sheer attrition if given enough time. Belisarius watched the center battle from his observation post. His staff officers were getting nervous. One suggested committing the cavalry reserves to reinforce the center. Belisarius shook his head. Quote 42, quote 43, quote 44, Belisarius cut him off. Quote 45, it was brutal calculus. Human lives reduced to mathematical variables. But war had always been mathematics written in blood. The question was whether the equation balanced, whether the center could hold long enough for the flanks to matter. Noon, 1 hour into the infantry assault. Roman casualties had climbed to 1,500. Persian casualties exceeded 4,000. The center trenches were literally filled with bodies. Soldiers were fighting while standing on corpses, slipping on blood-slicked ground, breathing air thick with the copper smell of massive bleeding. The entire central corridor had become an abattoir. And then, at 12:15 p.m., Perazes made the decision Belisarius had been waiting for all day. The Persian commander, watching his infantry assault stall against the Roman center, seeing his casualties mount without breakthrough, decided to commit his decisive weapon. He would send his cavalry against what appeared to be the weakest point in the entire Roman deployment. He would eliminate those 600 isolated Huns on the left flank hill. And once that position fell, his cavalry would sweep behind the Roman lines and crush Belisarius's army from behind. It was sound tactics. It was conventional doctrine. It was exactly what the mathematical trap had been designed to provoke. 8,000 Persian cavalry began forming up for the charge that would decide the Battle of DARA. On a distant hill, Sunicus and Igon watched them come and smiled. The brothers had been waiting for this moment since dawn. The Persians were about to discover what happened when you charged demons positioned on high ground. What happened in the next 17 minutes would become the stuff of legend. The moment when 600 warriors destroyed an empire's cavalry. The geometric proof was about to be written in Persian blood, and the numbers would be absolutely devastating. For 2 hours, 20,000 Roman infantry held against 10,000 Persian attackers, not through superior skill or courage, but through position. The trenches prevented the Persians from building momentum. Soldiers fighting uphill from trench bottoms couldn't generate the force needed to break a shield wall. Roman soldiers fighting from elevated positions could strike down at exposed heads and shoulders. The mathematics of terrain trumped the mathematics of numbers. By 1 p.m., the Persian infantry assault had stalled. 3,000 Persian soldiers lay dead in and around the trenches. Roman casualties were less than 800. Perazes pulled his infantry back and assessed the situation. The center would not break through frontal assault. It was time to use Persia's real advantage: cavalry superiority. Here's what those 2 hours had actually accomplished. The center battle hadn't been about winning. It had been about time. Every minute the Persian infantry spent locked in combat with Roman shields was a minute they couldn't respond to threats developing on the flanks. Every soldier Perazes committed to the central trenches was a soldier who couldn't be repositioned when the real battle began. Belisarius had turned the center into a strategic anchor, not meant to advance or break through, just to hold and consume Persian attention. The casualty exchange told the story. 3,000 Persian dead versus 800 Roman. Think about that ratio. The Persians were losing soldiers at nearly 4-to-1 despite having numerical superiority. This wasn't because Roman soldiers were better fighters. It was because every variable in the central corridor favored defense. The elevation difference was only 3 feet, barely noticeable to observers. But those 3 feet meant Roman soldiers struck downward, while Persians struck upward. Basic physics made every Roman sword swing more effective, and every Persian swing less. But what the chronicles don't tell you is how close the center actually came to breaking. Twice during those 2 hours, Persian assault groups had managed to break through the Roman shield wall. At 11:47 a.m., 200 Persian soldiers fought their way across the main trench and opened a gap in the Roman line approximately 30 yards wide. For 90 seconds, it looked like the entire center might collapse. Then Belisarius committed one of his mobile reserves, 500 cavalry that had been positioned exactly for this scenario. They charged into the gap, not to fight prolonged melee, but to plug the breach long enough for Roman infantry to reform their shield wall. 143 of those cavalry died in less than 3 minutes. But the line held. The second breakthrough came at 12:23 p.m. A Persian officer, his name lost to history, led a wedge of 300 elite infantry through the left corridor trench. They punched through 2 Roman ranks and were 50 yards behind the main defensive line. If they'd had support, if Persian had recognized the breakthrough and committed reserves, the entire Roman center would have collapsed from behind. But the Persian commander couldn't see what was happening in the chaos of the trench fighting. By the time he realized his forces had penetrated, Belisarius had already responded. 400 infantry reserves surrounded the breakthrough force and annihilated them. 300 Persian soldiers died in a circle, fighting back to back, refusing to surrender. The Romans gave them no chance to, anyway. 1 p.m. The Persian infantry withdrew. Not routed, but pulled back by their commanders. They had achieved nothing except consuming Roman defensive capacity. But here's what Persian saw when he evaluated the situation. The Roman center was still intact. His frontal assault had failed. His numerical superiority had meant nothing against those geometric trenches. Standard doctrine said to retreat, regroup, try again tomorrow. But Persian had 40,000 warriors. He had 12,000 cavalry that hadn't been seriously engaged. And he could see a glaring weakness in the Roman deployment. Those 600 Huns on the isolated hill. They'd been sitting there all morning, observers to the battle but not participants. They were separated from the main Roman line by approximately 300 yards of open ground. If Persian cavalry could sweep them away, they could roll up the entire Roman left flank from behind. The Roman center, already exhausted from 2 hours of brutal combat, would face attack from 2 directions simultaneously. The mathematical advantage of the trenches would become a trap, preventing Roman retreat or maneuver. Persian called his cavalry commanders together. The center is a fortress. We don't assault fortresses when we have mobility superiority. We go around them. The Roman left flank is anchored by a small force of mercenaries on that hill. Probably Huns based on their equipment. 600 warriors. I want 8,000 cavalry to eliminate them. A cavalry commander raised an eyebrow. 8,000 against 600? General, that's overwhelming force. Persian's finished. We're not taking chances. We sweep that hill clean, then wheel behind the Roman lines. The boy general has made a fatal mistake positioning those mercenaries in isolation. We'll make him pay for it. At 1:15 p.m., 8,000 Persian cavalry began forming up. The finest horsemen in the Sassanid Empire. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat. Soldiers who believed cavalry superiority decided battles. They looked at the hill where 600 Huns waited and saw an easy victory. A quick slaughter, a stepping stone to crushing the entire Roman army. What they didn't see was the trap they were riding into. What they didn't understand was that those 600 warriors weren't isolated by mistake. They were positioned with geometric precision. What they couldn't know was that Hun composite bows had an effective range 40 yards greater than Persian bows, and that elevation added another 20 yards to that advantage. On the hill, Sunicus and Aigen watched 8,000 cavalry forming up. The brothers checked their arrows one last time. Each Hun warrior carried 60 shafts, 36,000 arrows total, against 8,000 Persians that worked out to 4.5 arrows per enemy soldier. If every Hun maintained 12 shots per minute, their standard rate They could sustain maximum fire for exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes to destroy 8,000 Persian cavalry. The numbers seemed impossible, but Sunicus and Aigen had fought impossible battles their entire lives. They hadn't lost one yet. At 1:30 p.m., the Persian cavalry began their advance toward the hill. The charge that would decide the Battle of Dara was underway, and the mathematics of warfare were about to collide with the reality of Hun archery. What happened in the next 17 minutes would shock both armies and redefine ancient military tactics. The Persians were riding confidently toward their own destruction, and they had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. At 2 p.m., Perazes committed 8,000 cavalry to his right flank, targeting what appeared to be the weakest point in the Roman line, those 600 isolated Hun archers on the hill. If his cavalry could sweep away these mercenaries, they could roll up the entire Roman left flank from behind. 8,000 armored Persian cavalry, the elite of the Sassanid military, began their charge. Sunicus and Aigen watched them come. 600 Huns against 8,000 Persians. The mathematics were absurd. But Hun archers didn't fight like Roman soldiers. They didn't hold ground. They circled, fired, withdrew, fired again, turning battle into a lethal dance. And they had the high ground. As the Persians climbed the hill, Hun arrows began finding targets. Not a scattered volley, but concentrated fire that targeted officers and horses with mechanical precision. The Persian cavalry covered the 300 yards of flat ground in approximately 45 seconds. 8,000 horsemen in perfect formation, lances ready, confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority. They expected the Huns to break and run. Mercenaries always ran when facing impossible odds. These mercenaries had been paid to fight, not to die. The Persians had seen it 100 times before. At 200 yards, the Huns would realize their situation was hopeless. At 100 yards, they'd mount their horses and flee. At 50 yards, the Persians would be riding them down from behind. None of that happened. At 180 yards, the maximum effective range of Hun composite bows from elevated positions, 600 arrows flew simultaneously. 7,200 arrows per minute. The first volley hit the Persian formation like an invisible hammer. Officers fell from their saddles. Horses screamed and collapsed. The neat ranks of cavalry suddenly had gaps. Here's what made Hun archery genuinely terrifying. Roman archers aimed at formations, trusting that massed volleys would find targets somewhere in the enemy ranks. Persian archers did the same. Huns aimed at individuals. They picked targets: the officer with the plumed helmet, the standard bearer, the horse with the white star on its forehead, and killed them specifically, at 180 yards, while the targets were moving. With bows that could punch through scale armor, the Persian cavalry kept charging. They had absorbed casualties before. But as they began climbing the hill's slope, the mathematics shifted catastrophically against them. The hill rose at approximately a 15-degree angle. Not steep enough to stop cavalry, but steep enough to slow them. Horses that had been galloping at 20 miles per hour dropped to 12, and slower targets were easier to hit. 2:05 p.m. The Persians had covered half the distance to the Hun position. They had lost approximately 400 riders, 5% casualties in less than 5 minutes, normally acceptable losses. But these weren't normal casualties. The Huns were systematically eliminating officers and breaking up cohesive units. The 8,000 cavalry that had started in perfect formation were now fragmented into dozens of smaller groups, each acting independently. Communication between units broken. Think about what this meant tactically. A cavalry charge works through concentrated mass, thousands of horses striking a single point simultaneously. But the Persians couldn't concentrate. The slope disrupted their formations. The Hun arrows killed anyone who tried to organize a unified assault. By the time the first Persian riders reached the hilltop, they arrived in groups of 50 or 100, not as a unified force of 8,000. Sunnikas had positioned his 600 Huns in 3 staggered lines. The front line of 200 warriors fired, withdrew 10 yards uphill, notched fresh arrows, and fired again. The second line fired over the first line's heads, targeting Persians who had broken through the initial arrow storm. The third line held in reserve, ready to engage in close combat if the Persians actually reached the summit. It was a systematic killing machine that turned the hill into 3 sequential death zones. 2:12 p.m. Persian cavalry were dying at a rate of 150 warriors per minute. Not wounded, dead. The Huns weren't firing warning shots or attempting to suppress. They were executing precise kills. Every arrow that left a Hun bow was aimed to end a life. At this rate, the 8,000 cavalry would be reduced to 5,000 before any significant force reached melee range. But here's where it gets insane. The Persians kept coming. Not because their commanders ordered it. Most of their officers were dead. Not because retreat wasn't an option. Withdrawal down the hill would have been relatively safe. They kept coming because Persian cavalry culture emphasized courage above tactical sense. Retreating from mercenaries who were outnumbered 13-1 was unthinkable. Death was preferable to that kind of shame. At 2:15 p.m., the first Persian riders reached the hilltop. Approximately 300 cavalry, the survivors of the initial assault wave, crashed into the Hun front line. For 30 seconds, it was pure chaos. Lances thrust at archers, swords swung at mounted warriors. Horses trampled men who couldn't dodge fast enough. The disciplined Hun firing positions dissolved into individual melees. Then the Hun second and third lines counterattacked. Not a defensive response, but an aggressive surge that drove into the Persian cavalry from both sides. Huns fought with curved swords designed for mounted combat, striking at horses' legs and riders' exposed sides. The 300 Persians who had reached the summit found themselves surrounded. Outnumbered locally, even though they were part of a much larger force. Within 3 minutes, 200 of them were dead. The Persian cavalry assault was fracturing. The 8,000 riders who had charged confidently at 2 p.m. were now broken into isolated groups scattered across the hillside. Some were still climbing, facing continuous arrow fire. Some had reached the summit and were engaged in desperate close combat. Some were retreating down the hill, having finally accepted that numerical superiority meant nothing against Hun archery on elevated terrain. At 2:17 p.m., Belisarius played his final card. Roman cavalry reserves, 2,000 riders who had been positioned behind the left flank specifically for this moment, charged from their concealed positions. They struck the Persian cavalry at the base of the hill, hitting the formations that were still trying to reinforce their comrades on the summit. The Persians, focused on the Huns above them, never saw the Roman cavalry coming until lances were already punching through their flanks. 8,000 Persian cavalry found themselves trapped between Hun arrows from above and Roman lances from the side. The charge that was supposed to win the battle had become a slaughter. Warriors who had ridden confidently toward an easy victory were dying by the hundreds, unable to retreat, unable to advance. Caught in a geometric crossfire that Belisarius had designed specifically for this moment. On his observation post, Perazes watched in horror as his elite cavalry, the finest horseman in the Sassanid Empire, disintegrated. In 17 minutes, he had lost his decisive weapon. The force that was supposed to sweep the Roman flanks and crush Belisarius's army was dying on a hill held by 600 mercenaries who refused to break. What happened in the next 5 minutes would end the battle. The Persian army was about to discover that losing your cavalry superiority against a commander like Belisarius wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a death sentence. The Persian cavalry charge up the hill became a slaughter. Hun arrows, fired from elevated positions at close range, punched through armor. Horses fell, creating obstacles that tripped following ranks. The tight Persian formation, perfect for shock combat on flat ground, became a liability on sloped terrain where maneuverability mattered more than mass. Persian commanders screamed orders that couldn't be heard over the chaos. And then Belisarius sprang the second part of his trap. Roman cavalry, positioned behind trenches on the left flank, surged forward and struck the Persian cavalry from the side while they were still engaged with the Huns. 8,000 Persian cavalry found themselves trapped between Hun archers above and Roman lancers beside them, unable to retreat, unable to advance, dying in a killing zone that Belisarius had engineered with geometric precision. 2:20 p.m. The Roman cavalry charge hit with devastating precision. 2,000 lancers striking at exactly the angle Belisarius had calculated, targeting the Persian formations at the base of the hill where they were most densely packed and least able to maneuver. The impact was catastrophic. Persian cavalry, focused upward on the Hun position, never saw the Roman attack until it was already among them. Lances drove through sides and backs. Horses collided at full gallop. The organized Persian assault disintegrated into pure chaos. Here's what made the dual attack genuinely devastating. The Huns were killing from range, maintaining distance, shooting into the Persian mass from elevated positions. The Romans were killing up close, crashing into packed formations with the kinetic force of 2,000 horses at full charge. The Persians couldn't defend against both simultaneously. Raising shields against Hun arrows exposed them to Roman lances. Turning to face Roman cavalry left them vulnerable to Hun archery. Every defensive response to one threat created fatal exposure to the other. The casualty rate defied belief. Between 2:20 and 2:35 p.m., 15 minutes, the Persian right flank cavalry lost approximately 5,000 warriors. Think about those numbers. 5,000 dead or dying in a quarter of an hour. That's more than 5 casualties per second. Sustained continuously. The hillside was carpeted with bodies. Wounded horses screamed. The ground was so slick with blood that surviving Persians were slipping as they tried to retreat. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those 15 minutes. The Persians never broke, never routed, never fled in panic. Individual units fought with desperate courage even as the overall formation collapsed. Small groups of cavalry formed defensive circles, protecting wounded comrades, fighting back-to-back against impossible odds. Officers who should have retreated instead rallied their remaining soldiers for suicidal counterattacks. Persian military culture valued honor over survival, and that culture was being demonstrated in the most brutal way possible. At 2:30 p.m., a Persian cavalry commander named Barismanes, one of the few officers who had survived the initial assault, gathered approximately 300 riders and charged directly at the Hun position. Not a flanking maneuver, not a tactical withdrawal. A straight uphill charge into the concentrated fire of 600 archers. It was magnificent and suicidal. Hun arrows cut down half his force in the first 30 seconds. The survivors kept climbing. At 50 yards from the Hun lines, Barismanes had 70 riders left. At 20 yards, he had 30. At 10 yards, he had 12. Sunicus himself killed Barismanes. The Hun commander, recognizing the Persian officer by his armor and bearing, put 3 arrows into him in rapid succession. Barismanes fell from his horse 10 feet from the Hun line, still holding his sword, still trying to close the distance. The 12 Persian survivors died within seconds. Their courage had achieved nothing except adding 12 more bodies to the hill's growing carpet of dead. 2:40 p.m. The Persian cavalry assault on the left flank was over. Of 8,000 cavalry who had charged confidently 40 minutes earlier, fewer than 3,000 escaped. 5,000 lay dead or dying on and around the hill. The survivors were scattered, disorganized, their command structure shattered, their morale destroyed. The elite of the Sassanid cavalry, warriors who had never lost a major engagement, had been annihilated by 600 mercenaries and 2,000 Roman cavalry operating in perfect coordination. The Hun casualties were shockingly light: 83 dead, 147 wounded. Think about that exchange ratio. 600 warriors had faced 8,000 and emerged with less than 15% casualties while inflicting 62% casualties on their attackers. The numbers seemed impossible, but they were documented by both Roman and Persian chroniclers, confirmed by the physical evidence of bodies covering the hillside. Belisarius, watching from his command post, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The left flank trap had functioned exactly as designed. The Huns had held their position against impossible odds. The cavalry reserves had struck at precisely the right moment. The geometric principles underlying the entire battle plan had been validated in Persian blood. But the battle wasn't over. Perazes still had 30,000 warriors. He had lost his right flank cavalry, but his center infantry remained intact, and his left flank cavalry had not been engaged. A competent commander could regroup, reorganize, potentially salvage the situation. But here's what Belisarius understood that Perazes didn't. The psychological impact of the cavalry massacre exceeded its tactical significance. The Persian army had just watched their finest cavalry destroyed by a force that shouldn't have been able to resist. Morale was shattering across the entire Persian line. At 2:45 p.m., Belisarius gave the order he had been planning since before the battle began. All cavalry reserves, prepare for general assault. We attack in 5 minutes. Target the Persian center. They've been fighting for 3 hours. They're exhausted. Their right flank is gone. Their left flank is isolated. We're going to break them. His officers stared. The Roman army had been on the defensive all day. Standard doctrine said to let the enemy exhaust themselves, then defend against their withdrawal. Attacking a force that still outnumbered you was insane. But Belisarius saw what his officers didn't. The Persian army wasn't a unified force anymore. It was 3 separate fragments: a demoralized center, a destroyed right flank, and an isolated left flank that couldn't help the other 2 without exposing itself to the same fate. At 2:50 p.m., 5,000 Roman cavalry, every mounted reserve Belisarius possessed, formed up behind the center lines. The soldiers who had been defending trenches all day watched in amazement as their cavalry prepared to charge. The mathematics had shifted. For 5 hours, the Romans had been outnumbered. Now, at the decisive moment, Belisarius was about to achieve local superiority through pure tactical genius. The Persian center had no idea what was about to hit them. They were about to discover that the trenches they'd been fighting against all day weren't a defensive system. They were the framework for an offensive trap. And the trap was about to close with 5,000 cavalry driving straight through their exhausted formations. What happened in the next 20 minutes would end the battle and reshape ancient military. Doctrine. The boy general was about to teach the world how mathematics defeats empire. Between 2:15 and 2:32 p.m., the Persian right flank ceased to exist. Of 8,000 cavalry who charged the hill, fewer than 3,000 escaped. The rest lay dead or dying on a slope that Roman soldiers would later call, quote, 51 Perazes. Watching from the center, realized he had walked into a trap designed by someone who understood warfare at a level he had never encountered. The boy general had turned the battlefield into a geometric proof where numbers meant nothing. But the Persian commander had 40,000 warriors. Even after catastrophic losses on the right flank, he still outnumbered the Romans. He still had one option: a general assault with everything he had left. If he could break through anywhere, if he could force Belisarius to commit his reserves, the battle might still be salvageable. 2:45 p.m. Perazes called his remaining commanders together. The calculation was brutal but simple. He had started with 40,000 warriors. 5,000 cavalry were dead on the right flank. 3,000 infantry had died in the morning's trench assaults. Another 2,000 were too wounded to continue fighting. That left 30,000 effective soldiers. The Romans had 25,000, and they'd been fighting defensive battles all day with relatively light casualties. The numbers still favored Persia. Barely. Quote, 52 Perazes ordered. Quote, 53. It was sound tactical reasoning. The Roman defensive system had worked brilliantly in isolated engagements, but it depended on having reserves to plug gaps. If the Persians attacked along a 2-mile front simultaneously, Belisarius couldn't be everywhere at once. Simple mathematics said that defending forces spread too thin would fracture under sufficient pressure. Perazes was betting everything on overwhelming the Roman army through sheer sustained pressure. At 3 p.m., Persian horns sounded the general assault. 30,000 warriors surged forward along the entire Roman line. 10,000 infantry hit the center trenches again. 8,000 cavalry on the left flank began moving toward the Roman right. 12,000 soldiers, a mixture of infantry and cavalry, advanced on positions between the main defensive points, probing for weaknesses, searching for any gap in the Roman system. Here's what should have happened. The Romans, already exhausted from 5 hours of combat, should have started giving ground. Units should have broken under the renewed pressure. The defensive system, stretched to its limits, should have begun fracturing. Perazes was executing a textbook assault against an overextended defensive position. By every conventional measure, it should have worked. It didn't work because Belisarius had been waiting for exactly this moment. The entire defensive battle, the trenches, the Hun position, the cavalry reserves, had been designed to do one thing: force the Persians to commit everything to a final desperate assault. And when they did, when every Persian soldier was engaged and unable to respond quickly to threats, Belisarius would transform from defender to attacker. 3:05 p.m. The Persian general assault had been underway for 5 minutes. Persian soldiers were crossing trenches, engaging Roman infantry, pushing forward along multiple sections of the line. From Perazes' position, it looked like the assault was working. Roman formations were being pushed back in several locations. The center line was bending under sustained pressure. Then 5,000 Roman cavalry erupted from behind the center defensive positions. Not reserves responding to a breakthrough. An organized counterattack that had been pre-positioned for this exact moment. They didn't charge the Persian front lines. They charged through the gaps between Persian formations, driving wedges between units, isolating Persian assault groups from their support. Think about what this meant tactically. The Persians had committed 30,000 soldiers to a broad front assault, Those soldiers were spread across a 2-mile line, attacking in multiple locations simultaneously. But they weren't attacking as a unified force. They were attacking as dozens of separate units, each focused on their immediate objectives. Belisarius's cavalry charge exploited those gaps, turning a unified assault into isolated battles. 3:12 p.m. The Roman cavalry charge hit the Persian center formations with devastating effect. These weren't fresh troops attacking exhausted defenders. These were determined cavalry striking at infantry who were already engaged with other Roman forces, unable to form proper defensive formations against mounted assault. Persian units that had been pushing forward suddenly found Roman cavalry among them, cutting them off from support, forcing them to fight in multiple directions. But here's where it gets genuinely insane. The Roman cavalry weren't trying to destroy the Persian center. They were trying to panic it. Belisarius understood something fundamental about morale. Armies that had already witnessed catastrophic defeat elsewhere were prone to breaking when facing unexpected threats. The Persian soldiers attacking the center had spent the afternoon watching their right flank cavalry get annihilated. They were already shaken. Now Roman cavalry was among them, and they had no idea how many. The Persian center began to crack. Not all at once, not a complete rout, but individual units started pulling back. Officers screamed orders to hold position, but soldiers who had been fighting for 5 hours, who had seen thousands of their comrades die, who were now facing cavalry attacks from unexpected directions, began to break. First dozens, then hundreds. Then thousands of Persian soldiers stopped advancing and started looking for ways to disengage. 3:15 p.m. Persian recognized what was happening and made his final gamble. He committed his left flank cavalry, 4,000 riders who had been held in reserve all day, to a desperate charge aimed at the Roman right flank. If they could break through, if they could create chaos in the Roman rear, the center might stabilize. It was his last card. Belisarius had been waiting for that card too. As the Persian left flank cavalry charged, 2,000 Roman cavalry that had been concealed behind the right flank trenches emerged and struck them at an angle. Not a head-on collision, but a flanking attack that hit the Persian cavalry while they were still forming up for their charge. The Persian riders, surprised by cavalry appearing where they hadn't expected resistance, found their charge disrupted before it even reached full speed. 3:22 p.m. The Battle of DARA ended not with a climactic moment, but with a cascading collapse. The Persian center, seeing their left flank cavalry charge fail, seeing Roman cavalry operating with apparent impunity throughout their formations, seeing no reinforcements coming, broke. Thousands of soldiers who had fought courageously all day suddenly decided that survival mattered more than honor. The retreat started in the center and spread outward like a wave. Persian tried to rally his forces. He personally rode into the retreating formations, screaming orders, threatening executions. It didn't matter. The Persian army had reached its psychological breaking point. They had lost 5,000 cavalry in 17 minutes on the right flank. They had suffered 3,000 infantry casualties in the morning trenches. They had attacked all afternoon and achieved nothing. And now Roman cavalry was among them, and they couldn't tell how many. The organized Persian withdrawal became a rout. 30,000 soldiers who had attacked in formation began fleeing in disorder. Roman cavalry pursued, cutting down stragglers, but Belisarius ordered restraint. He didn't need to annihilate the Persian army. He needed them to run back to Persia carrying stories of what happened at DARA. By 4 p.m., the battlefield was quiet, except for the screaming of wounded men and dying horses. The Persian army was in full retreat toward their own territory. They would not stop running until they crossed back into Persia. the invasion was over. Belisarius stood on the battlefield he had designed and watched them go. In one day, using mathematics and terrain, he had defeated a force that outnumbered him nearly 2 to 1. The boy general had just announced himself to history, and warfare would never be quite the same. At 3 p.m., Persian committed his entire remaining force, 30,000 warriors, everything left after the morning's casualties, attacked along the entire Roman line simultaneously. This was no longer strategy. This was desperation transformed into violence. Persian infantry surged toward the center trenches. Cavalry probed both flanks. Archers fired in massed volleys meant to suppress Roman defensive fire. For 90 minutes, the battle hung in balance. Roman soldiers fought from behind trenches, but they were exhausted from 5 hours of combat. Persian numbers began to tell. Sections of the Roman line started buckling. Belisarius moved behind his formations, plugging gaps, rallying wavering units. If the Persians broke through anywhere, the entire defensive system would collapse. The mathematics that had protected Rome all day would become a trap that destroyed his army. 3:15 p.m. The Persian assault achieved what no previous attack had managed: simultaneous pressure along the entire 2-mile Roman defensive line. 25,000 Roman soldiers faced 30,000 Persians, with no reserves left uncommitted, no tactical tricks remaining, no geometric advantages that hadn't already been exploited. This was pure attrition warfare. Numbers against exhaustion. Fresh Persian units against Romans who had been fighting since dawn. The center trenches, which had held all morning, began to fail. Not because Roman soldiers broke, but because human bodies have limits. Men who had been swinging swords for 5 hours couldn't maintain the same intensity. Shields that had absorbed hundreds of blows developed cracks. Formations that had been perfectly aligned at 9 a.m. were ragged by 3 p.m. The Persians, rotating fresh troops to the front continuously, began pushing through gaps that hadn't existed an hour earlier. 3:25 p.m. A Persian infantry unit broke through the central trench at the exact point where it had been weakened by morning combat. 200 soldiers poured through the gap and found themselves behind the main Roman line. For 60 seconds, it looked like the entire center would collapse. Roman reserves that should have plugged the breach were already engaged elsewhere. Belisarius himself rode directly into the gap with his personal guard, 30 mounted warriors who crashed into 200 infantry in a suicidal attempt to buy time. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that moment. Belisarius killed 3 Persian soldiers personally in hand-to-hand combat. His horse was killed under him. He fought on foot while his guard formed a circle around him, holding the breach for exactly the 90 seconds needed for Roman infantry to reform their line. 14 of his 30 guards died. The general himself took a sword cut across his left arm that would leave a scar for the rest of his life. But the line held. Think about what that meant. The supreme commander of the Roman Eastern Army was fighting in a melee like a common soldier because the tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where mathematics no longer mattered. Only courage. Only the willingness to die to buy seconds. The perfect geometric system had been pushed beyond its limits. 3:40 p.m. The Roman right flank was collapsing. Persian cavalry, probing continuously, had finally found a weak point where exhausted infantry couldn't maintain their positions. 800 Persian riders broke through and began wheeling to attack the Roman center from behind. The defensive system that had held all day was coming apart in multiple locations simultaneously. Persian, watching from his command position, saw victory approaching. just a few more minutes, just a little more pressure. But Belisarius saw something Peroz's didn't. The Persian assault, despite its success, was completely extended. Every warrior was engaged, every reserve was committed, every unit was focused forward on breaking the Roman line. They had achieved penetration in multiple locations, but they weren't organized for exploitation. They were 30,000 individual soldiers fighting desperately, not a unified army executing a coordinated plan. 3:45 p.m. Belisarius made the decision that would define his entire career. Every military doctrine said to defend when outnumbered. Every tactical manual said to preserve your forces when facing imminent defeat. Every survival instinct said to retreat, while retreat was still possible. Belisarius ordered a general counterattack. Every cavalry reserve, every mobile unit, every soldier who could still mount a horse would charge directly into the Persian center. His second-in-command stared at him. "General, we're barely holding. If we abandon our defensive positions, the Persians are extended and exhausted." Belisarius interrupted, wrapping a cloth around his wounded arm. "They've been attacking for 45 minutes without achieving decisive breakthrough. Their morale is fragile after watching their right flank destroyed. If we hit them now, hit them hard with everything we have left, they'll break, not because we're stronger, because they're more afraid." 3:50 p.m. 5,000 Roman cavalry, scraped together from every available reserve, including units that had been engaged just 30 minutes earlier, formed up behind the center line. Many were wounded. Most were exhausted. All of them thought the general had lost his mind. You don't counterattack when you're losing. You don't abandon defensive positions when those positions are the only thing keeping you alive. But Belisarius had seen something in the Persian assault that no one else recognized. The difference between an army that was winning and an army that was simply advancing. The Persians were attacking because they had no other option. Not because they believed victory was imminent. They had lost too much, seen too many die, watched their finest cavalry destroyed by mercenaries who shouldn't have been able to resist. Their attack was momentum, not confidence. 4 p.m. The Roman cavalry charged, not a careful, organized advance. A desperate surge of 5,000 riders who understood this was the last gamble. If this failed, the army was finished. If this worked, the battle would turn on pure psychology rather than mathematics. The charge hit the Persian center like a hammer striking glass. The Persians, engaged in close combat with Roman infantry, never saw the cavalry coming until it was among them. Horses crashed into packed formations. Lances drove through soldiers whose shields were facing the wrong direction. The Persian advance, which had been slowly overwhelming Roman positions, suddenly found itself fighting for survival rather than victory. What happened in the next 30 minutes would exceed every calculation, break every prediction, and prove that warfare wasn't just mathematics after all. Sometimes it was courage meeting exhaustion at exactly the right moment. Sometimes it was knowing when to abandon perfect tactics for desperate gambles. Sometimes it was a 25-year-old general with a bleeding arm leading a cavalry charge that shouldn't work, but would shatter an empire's army anyway. The endgame of DARA was about to begin, and the Persians were about to discover that desperation can be a more powerful weapon than numerical superiority. At 4:30 p.m., Belisarius made a decision that defied every defensive doctrine in existence. He ordered a counterattack. His cavalry, which had been held in reserve precisely for this moment, would charge the Persian center while their infantry was fully committed to the trench assaults. Every officer who heard the order thought the general had lost his mind. You don't counterattack when defending against superior numbers. You don't abandon your defensive positions to chase an enemy who still outnumbers you. But Belisarius had been waiting all day for this exact moment, when the Persians were completely committed, unable to react quickly. Their formation extended and vulnerable. 5,000 Roman cavalry emerged from behind the trenches and charged directly into the Persian center. The impact was catastrophic. The charge covered 120 yards in approximately 8 seconds. 5,000 horses accelerating to full gallop, hooves thundering like sustained thunder, creating a wall of muscle and steel that struck the Persian center formations with the force of a collapsing building. The Persians, engaged in brutal melee combat with Roman infantry just seconds before, had no time to form defensive positions against cavalry. They had no time to organize, no time to brace. Here's what made the charge devastating beyond its physical impact. The Persian infantry in the center had been fighting continuously for 90 minutes. They were exhausted, their formations ragged, their command structure fragmented by hours of combat. When 5,000 fresh cavalry crashed into them from an unexpected direction, it wasn't just the kinetic force that mattered. It was the psychological shock. Roman cavalry appearing where there shouldn't be cavalry. Organized assault emerging from what had been defensive positions. The impossible becoming real. 4:32 p.m. The Roman cavalry drove through the Persian center like a spear through cloth. Not a grinding melee, but a pure momentum-based assault that relied on speed and mass. Lancers in the front ranks aimed at officers and standard bearers. Kill the leaders, drop the banners, break the unit cohesion. Cavalry behind them swung swords at soldiers too slow to dodge. The Persian center, which had been slowly overwhelming Roman defenses, suddenly found itself fighting for survival. Think about the mathematics of the moment. 30,000 Persians were spread across a 2-mile front, attacking in multiple locations. The 5,000 Roman cavalry didn't attack everywhere. They hit one specific point with overwhelming concentrated force. At the impact zone, the Romans achieved temporary numerical superiority. 5,000 cavalry against perhaps 3,000 infantry. For 90 seconds, the Persians weren't facing a defensive army. They were facing a hammer strike that broke their formations, then killed their officers faster than replacements could organize. The Persian center began to fracture. Not a complete collapse, not yet, but visible cracks in formations that had been solid minutes earlier. Units on both sides of the cavalry impact zone pulled back, trying to create space, trying to reorganize against this unexpected threat. That created gaps, and Roman infantry, who had been defending desperately, saw those gaps and advanced through them. 4:35 p.m. Perazes, watching from his command position, finally understood what Belisarius had done. The entire defensive battle, the trenches, the Hun position, the calculated retreats, had been designed to create this exact moment. The moment when the Persian army was fully extended, completely committed, psychologically vulnerable from earlier defeats. The moment when a cavalry charge could turn numerical superiority into tactical disaster. But here's what made Belisarius' decision genuinely insane. The charge was working, but it had also abandoned the defensive system that had protected Rome all day. If the Persians rallied, if they organized a coordinated response, the Roman cavalry would be surrounded and destroyed. The entire army would collapse. Belisarius had wagered everything. His army, his career, the eastern frontier, potentially the empire itself, on a single moment of psychological warfare. 4:37 p.m. The Persian left flank cavalry, which had been held in reserve, began moving toward the breakthrough point to support their collapsing center. 4,000 riders forming up for a charge that would hit the Roman cavalry from the side. If they connected, if they struck while the Roman cavalry was still entangled with Persian infantry, the battle would turn again. Belisarius would have gambled everything and lost. Then the 600 Huns came down from their hill. They had been watching the battle unfold from elevated positions. They had seen the Roman cavalry charge. They had seen the Persian left flank cavalry forming up. And Sunicus and Agon had decided, without orders, without coordination, to do what Hun warriors had always done: attack the moment when glory was possible. 600 Hun horse archers crashed into the 4,000 Persian cavalry from their flank. Not a frontal charge, but a sweeping attack that fired arrows while moving, striking the Persian formations while they were still organizing. The Persians, focused on supporting their center, never saw the Huns coming. Within 60 seconds, 300 Persian cavalry were down. The remainder, recognizing the Hun attack and remembering what had happened on the hill earlier, broke before even engaging. 4:40 p.m. The Persian army reached its psychological breaking point. The center was shattered by Roman cavalry. The right flank had been destroyed hours earlier. The left flank cavalry was fleeing from Hun arrows. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. Units that had fought courageously all day suddenly decided that survival mattered more than honor. The retreat began in isolated pockets, then spread like fire. Persian tried desperately to rally his forces. He rode into the retreating formations personally, threatening executions, appealing to pride. A few units stopped and reformed. Most kept running. The Persian commander realized, with terrible clarity, that the battle was lost. Not because his army had been defeated in combat, but because they had been broken psychologically by a commander who understood that morale was as much a weapon as swords. 4:45 p.m. The Battle of DARA ended. 30,000 Persian soldiers, who had attacked confidently just 2 hours earlier, were in full retreat toward their own territory. Roman cavalry pursued for approximately 3 miles, cutting down stragglers, but Belisarius ordered restraint. He didn't need to annihilate the Persian army. He needed survivors to carry stories back to Persia. Stories of the boy general who had turned mathematics into victory. Stories of the battle that should have been impossible. By 5 p.m., the battlefield was silent, except for the moaning of wounded and the screaming of dying horses. 10,000 Persian soldiers lay dead. Another 5,000 were wounded or captured. Roman casualties were approximately 3,000 dead, 4,000 wounded. The exchange ratio was devastating. More than 2 Persian casualties for every Roman loss, despite the Persians having numerical superiority throughout the battle. Belisarius stood among the trenches he had designed and watched the Persian army disappear toward the horizon. His arm was bandaged. His armor was covered in blood, most of it not his own. His horse was dead, killed in the gap fighting hours earlier. But he had done what every expert said was impossible. He had defeated 40,000 Persians with 25,000 Romans. And he had done it through something no one had seen before: warfare as applied mathematics. The 25-year-old general had just changed military history. The question now was what his victory would actually mean. The Persian army disintegrated in less than 20 minutes. The cavalry charge into their center created panic that spread like fire through dry grass. Units that had been fighting all day, exhausted and bloodied, broke and ran when Roman cavalry appeared where they shouldn't exist. Persian tried to rally his forces, but the mathematics of morale had shifted completely. His soldiers had attacked all day and achieved nothing. They had lost 8,000 cavalry to 600 Huns. Now Roman cavalry was carving through their center. The army that had marched confidently toward Dara that morning fled in disorder toward Persia. By sunset, 10,000 Persian soldiers lay dead on the battlefield. Another 5,000 would die during the retreat, hunted by Roman cavalry and local populations seeking revenge for years of raids. Belisarius had lost 3,000 men. The Battle of DARA was over. 5 p.m. The battlefield stretched for 2 miles, carpeted with the dead and dying. The trenches that Belisarius had designed were filled with bodies. Persian soldiers who had died trying to cross, Roman soldiers who had died defending. Persian Hill, on the left flank, was a monument of corpses. 5,000 cavalry who had charged 600 Huns and never returned. The central corridor where the final battle had occurred was slick with blood, the ground churned to mud by thousands of feet and hooves. The casualty count told the story of what had actually happened at DARA. 40,000 Persians had attacked. 15,000 were dead, wounded, or captured. That's a 37% casualty rate, catastrophic by any measure. But here's what made those numbers genuinely devastating. The Persian losses were concentrated among their best troops. The 8,000 cavalry destroyed on the hill were elite warriors, veterans with decades of experience. The 3,000 infantry killed in the morning trench assaults were professional soldiers. The empire hadn't just lost numbers, it had lost quality, experience, leadership. Roman casualties were 3,000 dead, 4,000 wounded, 7,000 total from an army of 25,000, a 28% casualty rate. Severe losses, but survivable. More critically, the Roman casualties were distributed relatively evenly across all units. No single formation had been destroyed. Command structure remained intact. The army could regroup, refit, and fight again within weeks. Think about what this meant strategically. Persia had gambled a quarter of its total military strength on capturing DARA and demonstrating Roman weakness. That gamble had failed catastrophically. Shah Kavad would need years to rebuild the forces he had lost. The border raids that had plagued Rome's eastern provinces for 3 decades would stop, not because Persia chose to stop them, but because Persia no longer had the military capacity to conduct them. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about DARA's immediate aftermath. The victory's psychological impact exceeded its tactical significance. Word of the battle spread across the eastern Mediterranean within weeks. The story wasn't just that Rome had won. It was how Rome had won. A 25-year-old commander using geometry and defensive innovation had destroyed an army nearly twice his size. Every military mind in the civilized world wanted to understand how. Persian morale collapsed across the entire frontier. Cities that had been preparing to welcome Kavad's victorious army instead reinforced their defenses against potential Roman counterattacks. Tribal allies who had been negotiating to join Persia's next invasion suddenly remembered they had always been neutral. The psychological weapon that Persia had wielded for 30 years, the belief that they would always win when they chose to attack, shattered against Belisarius's trenches. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian received the news of DARA on June 15th, 9 days after the battle. He had appointed Belisarius, expecting competent defense. He had gotten revolutionary victory. The emperor immediately began planning Western campaigns, confident that his eastern frontier was secure. Within 5 years, Roman armies would reconquer North Africa. Within 15 years, they would retake Italy. The resources for those campaigns came directly from the security Belisarius had purchased at DARA. But the battle's most lasting impact was on military doctrine itself. For centuries, defensive warfare had been considered inferior to offensive operations. Fortifications were for weak armies. Real victories came from bold attacks and cavalry superiority. DARA proved that defense, properly designed, could be more devastating than offense. The geometric principles Belisarius employed, channeling enemy movement, creating overlapping fields of fire, positioning reserves for counterattack, became foundational to military engineering for the next 1,000 years. Medieval castles with their concentric walls and killing zones, Renaissance fortifications with their angular bastions, even modern defensive systems with their interlocking fields of fire, all of them trace intellectual lineage back to the trenches of DARA. Belisarius had proven that warfare wasn't just about courage or numbers. It was about mathematics, geometry, and understanding that the battlefield itself could be a weapon. June 7th, dawn. Belisarius stood on the plain where 40,000 Persians had attacked the previous morning. His army was burying the dead, tending the wounded, salvaging equipment from the battlefield. The work would take days. The smell would linger for weeks, but the victory would echo for centuries. His second-in-command approached, exhausted but alive. "General, the final casualty counts are complete. We lost 3,017 dead, another 4,200 wounded, half of them seriously. The Persians lost between 14 and 15,000. The exact number is uncertain because many died during the retreat." Belisarius nodded, still looking at the trenches that had saved Rome. "And the Hun casualties?" 83 dead, 147 wounded. Sunicus is requesting his payment plus a bonus for the unauthorized attack on the Persian left flank cavalry. Belisarius smiled for the first time since the battle began. "Pay them double. They earned it." He turned to face his officer. "Send a dispatch to the emperor. Tell him the eastern frontier is secure. Tell him Persia won't be raiding our provinces anymore. Tell him we're ready for whatever he wants to do next." The officer saluted and left. Belisarius remained on the battlefield, alone with the evidence of what mathematics could accomplish when applied to warfare. He was 25 years old. He had just defeated an empire, and he was only getting started. The Battle of DARA had ended. But the legend of Belisarius, the general who turned geometry into victory, who made trenches more dangerous than cavalry, who proved that innovation mattered more than numbers, was just beginning. He would go on to reconquer much of the Western Roman Empire, to defeat the Vandals and Goths, to become the most celebrated military commander of the 6th century. But he would never fight a more perfect battle than DARA, never demonstrate more clearly that warfare was mathematics written in blood, never prove more decisively that genius could defeat numbers when the genius understood that the battlefield itself was the weapon. 40,000 Persians had marched toward DARA, believing numbers would decide the outcome. They were wrong. Mathematics decided the outcome. And the boy general who understood that principle had just changed military history forever.